So, the third and final part. If you missed the first two ones, check the link up in the corner or down in the description. I will keep this intro short and come back at the end and do the final summary, last thoughts, future plans, etc, etc. So, let's get on with the build. Next, I will remove the fork and install the proper headset and make sure everything is nice and greased up. At the start of the build, I put the headset from my crashed bike on temporarily just while working on the bike. In hindsight, I could have done this right from the beginning, as I didn't really have to remove the fork as I thought I would have to when routing the brake hoses and DI2. As the hoses are internally routed through the handlebars, it became quite tight and cumbersome to do this, and as you can see, I ended up doing this down on the floor with all my limbs put to work. Home mechanic shenanigans at its best. So with the fork out of the frame, I removed the old headset bearings and made sure I had all the parts for the new one ready to go. So I put some fresh grease on the lower bearing seat first, a nice thick layer. I always like to go a bit overboard with the grease here. Then I greased up the bearing itself and pushed it into the frame. I could just have put the bearing on the crown race instead and not needing to worry about it falling out. In this case though, the grease seemed to keep that bearing in place, no problem. Only thing I would point out here is that the bearing has an angled side and you need to match that with the angled side of the bearing seat. Then I put the layer of grease on the top bearing seat and on the crown race of the fork. The open fork has a molded carbon race, so no need to mess around with separate races that you need to press on, and this style of molded in crown races also saves a pretty hefty chunk of weight, and that's always a bonus in my eyes. Then I threaded the fork back into the frame. Put some grease on the top bearing as well, and just like the bottom bearing, this bearing has an angled side that I need to match up with the angle of the bearing seat. Then I just put on the bearing wedge, and after that the headset top cover. Then I just took some degreaser in a paper towel and wiped off the stereo tube, as I don't want any grease, making it even easier for the stem to slip around. I also made sure to wipe off any excess around the bearing top cap and the fork crown. Then I put the stem and handlebar back on the bike and tighten this down just so everything stays in place. I will do the final adjustment and preloading of the headset when I'll dial in my position a bit later on. To do that final position adjustment, I needed to get the brakes dialed in so I could ride a bike. So I put the brake rotor on my road wheels that I had taken apart after the crash to inspect, and everything seemed normal there. I removed the bleed block from the front caliper and then installed the brake pads. Then I put the wheel back into the fork. As these brake pads are not brand new, I needed to pump the lever a few times to get the pistons out enough to make the pad bite to the rotor. I tightened down the brake calipers, and as you can hear, they needed some adjustment. So I used the classic method here. I loosened the bolts, squeezed the brake lever and tightened the bolts down again, and I was lucky enough to get this working without any rubbing on my second try. Then I just put in my gravel wheels as well, just to confirm that I didn't need to readjust anything again. Both these wheels have the DT Swiss 240S hubs. The disc alignment seemed to be pretty spot on between the two wheel sets. So that's something to think about if you're going with two different wheel sets. Having the same hub will make your life a bit easier, I think. Then I needed to do the same thing at the rear, remove the bleed block and install the brake pads. As I was doing this, I started to think about what wheels I would actually use during this winter. I decided to use my gravel wheels, and as I had my 46 cassette mounted on that one, I decided to swap that out for my 42 cassette instead, as I don't really need that 46 for the kind of riding I will do this winter. The 46 is more of a bike packing setup in my case, and a 42-42 combination will take me up pretty much all the climbs I can find around my area. And last but not least, that 42 cassette is a lot lighter than the 46 one, so stay tuned for the final weight. Back to the brake adjustments. I put the wheel back into the bike and did basically the same thing to my rear caliper as I did to the front. Loosened the bolts, squeeze the brake lever and tighten the bolts again, and that's all it took this time, luckily. Now we're getting closer to having this bike rideable. Next step for me was installing the pedals. I just put some grease on the threads and used that pedal washer that came with the crank, remembering to check the left and right marking on the pedal, as the drive side pedal has normal threads and the non-drive side pedal has reverse threads. As this is Shimano, I tightened this down with a 8mm hex key. I honestly prefer pedal wrenches as they're a bit easier to reach around with. Unfortunately, on these XT SPD pedals there are no slots for pedal wrenches, so the hex key has to do. As I'm running 1x, I don't need to mount the front mech. Luckily on this open frame, you can remove the front derailleur tab with a hex key and save a few grams on that tab. And just to take it a bit further, I replaced the screws with some nylon screws I found on Amazon, just because the weight weenie in me is still very much alive, even though you could argue that it doesn't make that much sense on a gravel bike, but still. Every gram you can save is still a gram, and yeah, I can't really justify it with logic. It's always something I will do if I can. I'm just sick. I'm sick in the head. I know I need help, but shogunai, as we say here in Japan. Then I will just mount my Arundel mandible cages. I love these things. These have been with me for a couple of years and a couple of bikes now, and I have never lost a bottle. They're almost a bit too tight. Next, I decided to put on a chainstay protector. I actually forgot to put this on my first bike. Went out for a test ride, hit a pothole and nicked my chainstay. So I definitely did not want that to happen again. So I just made sure the chainstay was clean and dry. This is a pretty cheap semi-thick chain protector, and I found this to have worked pretty good on both my Open and my old Mason Bokeh, so I decided to use the same one again. If I know I'm going on a really rough terrain, I might actually put on a removable one just for that extra peace of mind. But I like it to be simple and preferably not be visible at all, so the clear one will be the base protection at least. So next I wanted to secure the handlebar end junction. I put the holder on and used some double-sided tape to keep that junction in place. That double-sided tape will come in handy when I start wrapping the handlebar tape, once I've decided exactly where I want my shift levers. Speaking of that, I then prepared the bars for that first little trial run, making sure I had the right angle on the tops and that the bars were straight. And once I did that, I realized my hoods were angled very low, so I needed to adjust that. I also made sure the horizontal angle of the hoods was about where I wanted them. This is highly personal, of course. It's nice to get in the ballpark before wrapping the handlebar tape. But even if you wrap the handlebars, you can usually still adjust this a bit after the fact. After I was happy with the positions of the levers and the handlebars, I made sure everything was tightened down to spec and then moved on to the saddle and seat post. In terms of saddle position, I'm not very sensitive to small changes. I can see my marks on the rails from my old bike. I just put the saddle fore aft in the same position and try to start with the saddle level horizontally, and I will probably make some adjustments here once I get on the bike. My old NV seat post here has been with me now for 5 years or something like that, and it's definitely starting to show a lot of wear. I can tell that by the fact that if I don't use a lot of carbon paste, it will slip with the spec 5 Newton meters clamping force. So I'm being very generous with the carbon paste, and then measure my saddle height, which is around 77 centimeters. Like I said, I'm not super picky when it comes to this. I usually play around with the height as well during the season. I try to wipe off any excess carbon paste, and then I just tighten down the seat clamp to 5 Newton meters. Then I took the bike out, had a quick ride on it just to make sure the levers, the stem, the handlebars and everything was in the right place. Back in the bike room, I used a hairdryer to shrink the shrink tubing around the brake hose and the Di2 cable. I wanted to do this before I started to wrap the handlebar tape, just to make sure I don't melt anything around the tape. As for the actual handlebar tape, in this case I use Pro's Sports Control handlebar tape. It's the 2.5 millimeter thick one, I think. I like to ride without gloves when I can, and this is just thick enough for me, and it's very cheap, so it's not the end of the world to replace this. I used to be a big fan of the Blizzard Skin bar tape, but the prices are pretty ridiculous for what it is, so I ended up using this Pro bar tape for the last 3 wraps, I think. So to wrap the handlebar tape, when you are using the Di2 handlebar end junction, you basically start off by cutting the tape diagonally, just like as you would at the top of the bars when you're finishing off the wrap. Then I will use that double-sided tape I used when securing the Di2 junction, remove that cover tape and start wrapping the bars. I know there's probably a lot of opinions on which way you wrap your handlebar tape. I think it depends on if you're a pusher or a puller. In my case, I found this has been working very good for me for the last couple of wraps I've done, so I continue doing this stuff. I also like to wrap my levers with the figure 8 to have a bit more girth around the lever. I have something to grab onto. This usually means though that my bar tapes comes up a bit short. In a perfect world, I would like to have about 1 more centimeter of wrap here, I think, but I'm not too picky. My finishing tape is actually a half width electrical tape. I never use the finishing tape that comes with the bar tape. I never think it looks very good, to be honest. That is just my personal opinion. Instead, I use this half width electrical tape that leaves a nice and neat finishing job. If I were to give any kind of tip while wrapping the bars, is never to stretch the electrical tape once you finish the wrap off. If you stretch it, it would just end up being a lot of adhesive stuff coming out and making everything all sticky. The other side of the bar, I wrapped the traditional way with a bar end plug. I could use the dummy plug that comes with the Di2 junction, but yeah, I couldn't be bothered. And as you see here, I'm not afraid to unwrap and rewrap if I have to. I rather do this a couple of times and get it nice and neat than have some uneven wrapping going on. So that's it for the wrap. As the finishing touch here, I will use some clear tape or protective tape. I think you can find it under helicopter tape or something like that in the States. I will use that tape to just cover that area where my front brake hose kind of rubs a bit when turning the bars on the head tube, just to keep that from wearing down the paint. I will also put the same kind of tape when I put on bike packing bags and stuff like that. So it's a nice tip if you want to protect your paint finish as much as possible. I also realized I forgot to insert a safety clip in my brake caliper. So that will be the final step of this build. And all that's left now is to go out and ride it. So I think this is it for this build. Always fun to build a new bike. Since this is crash replacement frame, there wasn't any real surprises here. It needs to be said though, kudos to Open for that crash replacement policy. I crashed my frame and I got 50% off of a new frame. If you compare that to Canyon's policy, they offered me 20% off a new frame, which wasn't even crashed. It just cracked, but that's another story. Kudos to Open, for sure. I already talked about the new parts in my first ride video, but compared to my first build, new handlebars, a new crank, and both have been excellent. I especially like the new handlebars. Like I said in the build there, I wish I had a little bit longer bar tape. Would be nice to have like a 1 centimeter more here. Not the end of the world though. I'll survive. The hardest part was for sure routing the brake hoses through the handlebar. That was pretty annoying. One tip that I got in the comments there was to use some kind of lubricant or even like soap just to put a bit on the hoses when pushing them through the handlebars. And that sounds like a really good idea, so definitely try that. Also a few comments that I should have used a rope or a string and used a vacuum cleaner to route everything through the bars. I did that in my first build of this Open, not this Open, but the crashed Open. Also had a video of that, so if you want to see how you use a vacuum to route Di2 through the handlebars, check that video, as this was already prepared for internal routing with those plastic hoses and everything. I didn't think I needed those, but in hindsight it might have been a good idea. But it all went good in the end. One thing I wish I had done a bit more neater was the string tubing. As you can see here, I should have made sure the Di2 cable didn't wrap around the hose like it does here, but yeah, might fix that in the future. For now though, this will have to do. There were a few comments and a lot of good tips on the other parts of the build video, so if you're building up your own bike, the comments section is definitely a nice gold mine to dig through. In terms of future plans, I always look for places to shave a few grams because I'm sick in the head. So stay tuned for that. I might have something coming up soon. As always, if you have any comments or questions about the build, feel free to leave them down in the comments. And I almost forgot, if you found this video or build series interesting and helpful, feel free to leave a like, always appreciated, and subscribe for more content coming up soonish. And I will catch you in the next one. Peace.